Hi. Good morning, everyone. My name is Fabrice Julian, and today's talk is titled Parent Expectations, Student Achievement, and Depression, exploring the expectation differences among Black parents. And this is kind of the front end of what will be a dissertation proposal, or what I hope to be a dissertation proposal. So as far as the presentation outline, I'll get into central research questions. We'll discuss the background and significance. Then I'll delve into the target population. And we'll get into the literature on parent expectations in academic achievement, then parent expectations in mental health outcomes, the literature on academic achievement and depression. And then we'll get into Black heterogeneity, which will tie to our target population. And then we'll discuss a theoretical framework, conceptual model, and the hypotheses that I'm proposing. So to begin, how are parent expectations of educational achievement related to student academic performance? And how is the subsequent academic performance related to student mental health outcomes? And the question of what role do social origins play in these matters? So these questions really are guiding my interest in researching this area of the effect of expectations on students. So the current literature notes that there's a positive relationship between academic achievement and parent expectations. So this signifies that an increase in academic performance aligns with increased parental expectations and oversight. And the literature also notes that there's a negative relationship between academic achievement and depression, which signifies that greater reports of depression align with lower academic achievement. So bearing these two kind of central literature statements and where the field is at with this topic, I'm really trying to seek to understand how one social origins can serve as a predictor of the amount of academic pressure and subsequent depression students might experience, and in particular, immigrant children. So let's talk about the target population. The target population are Black students, and Black student achievement is well studied subject in the social sciences, but rarely are comparative assessments made for kind of within group differences. So this is where I hope to be contributing something novel. There's definitely a need to explore Black heterogeneity, and later I'll discuss what that heterogeneity looks like. And it really is kind of exploring differences between Black immigrant children and native-born African American students. So studies of Black immigrants have, for the most part, disconnected from studies of minority achievement and linked instead to immigration literature. So much of the literature is focused on immigration and not really getting into too much of the academic side. Delving now into parent expectations and academic achievement. The literature notes that immigrant status can increase expectations. We also know that immigrant parents have higher educational expectations for their children than do native parents. Now, there could be a selection effect for this, in that some of the individuals in the sample size who have immigrated to the United States may be individuals who in their native nations have the means, one, or have the talent to be allowed to immigrate to the U.S. So that could be influencing the parent expectation in itself, and that's an important distinction to make. As far as parent expectations and mental health outcomes, literature notes that greater parental warmth is associated with better student academic performance and psychological functioning. So that parental warmth can really serve as a potentially a proxy for low expectations. And then we know that demanding this serves as a proxy for high expectations, and that has positive correlations with increased anxiety. Now, parent expectations and mental health outcomes, continuing on. Recent literature has noted that students who face greater parental pressure experience greater anxiety than those with more understanding or lax parents. And it's common for this immigrant population, for accolades that immigrant students receive, for those to be transferred to the family members. So not succeeding might generate some criticisms from the community as well as shame for both the parents and the students. So this creates the potential for a role strain in the students at this pretty intricate phase in life, in adolescence, in which identity is trying to be formed, and it's okay, I'm not meeting this expected image of what I'm supposed to be doing. So that significantly can influence depression. Going now to Black heterogeneity, we know that the Black immigrant population in the U.S. is growing. Now, the heterogeneity of the U.S. Black population is important to consider because of the outcomes and experiences that vary within this defined group. So Black immigrants are said to have more education and higher incomes than U.S. born African Americans. That's a study from Kent in 2007. And the Census Bureau, from which Kent cited, notes that Black immigrants fare better than African Americans on socioeconomic indicators like income, education, residential segregation. So again, some selection effects could be explaining this. Now, as far as theoretical framework for this, the status attainment model is an important one to be mindful of. Status attainment model from Sewell and Hauser talks about just the academic trajectories and how that reflects the influence of parental expectations. And then, of course, the stress process model is one that takes into consideration the possibility of role strain and the impact that stress has on mental health outcomes. So all of this, bearing all of this in mind, I've created this conceptual model in which social origins, sociodemographics are definitely taken into consideration. But in this case, it's going to work together with the status of the student, whether they're native born or immigrant born. And that can influence the degree of educational expectations that the parents have, which can influence academic achievement all the way to influencing depressive symptoms. So, bearing all of this in mind, the hypotheses that I have, children who come from households where parents hold high expectations for academic achievement are going to experience higher levels of depressive symptoms. And that children who come from immigrant households will have parents who hold highest expectations for academic achievement. And that children who come from households where parents hold high expectations for academic achievement will achieve more than their counterparts who do not come from strict households. And that Black immigrant children whose academic achievement are low will experience higher levels of depressive symptoms, tapping into the role strain. And the effect of social origins on depression will vary by the academic achievement of the student. So that is my one moderating hypothesis. Okay, so this being my front end, I'm very curious on comments, suggestions, and ideas that you have on this topic and ways that I can further it. I do hope to next look into kind of the difference between the 1.5 generation and the second generation. And the 1.5 generation are those who were born in abroad but grew up here in the United States. And then the second generation are those who were born here to immigrant parents. So I'd be interested in seeing what the difference between the two are, because as scholars have pointed out, there's great disagreement between which of these two groups do we end up using for the Black immigrant student population. Do we stick to a 1.5 generation, or do we go to a second generation? Do we combine them? Is it wise to combine them and to not look at those intragroup differences? So my next step is going to explore the difference between 1.5 and 2 before ultimately looking at the difference between the immigrant born students and the native born students. Questions? Caleb?
Good presentation. I think this is a really important area to do some research. When you're talking about academic achievement, what level are you looking at, like elementary school kids, college kids?
Yeah, no, these are high school students.
Okay.
So
adolescents.
Yeah, so adolescents, yeah. So operationalizing academic achievement, I have variables that tap into their standardized test scores and grade point average. And grade point average was the one I was leaning towards using.
Where are you going to draw this data from?
So right now it exists with the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study. Pretty much all of our variables here are can be, pretty much all of these can be operationalized to a variable within that data set.
Is there a variable for anxiety in that data set? Because I think that will be important for you to look at as well.
Yeah, there are questions that tap into anxiety. There's no, not sure there's a scale or anything like that, but anxiety is a question, and I think it's part of the CESD short form depression score that they end up having. So.
I don't think there's a measure of anxiety in the CESD.
CSD.
But I'm sure if they're measuring CESD, there's probably another measure of anxiety somewhere in there. It'll be important to look at.
What would a direct question of anxiety be? Would it ask, how anxious do you feel, or?
I mean, a lot of the measures of anxiety are kind of based on like the physical symptoms. So, like the GAD-7 is a typical anxiety measure. I don't know if they have it in this data set, but it's usually like, do you feel shaky, or kind of more of the physical manifestations. I have to think more about the cognitive manifestations of anxiety and what gauges those.
Might have, are you often in the past week have you felt tense, anxious, and nervous?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not getting at the physical, but it might be what you'll see in that data set. And sometimes people combine the depression questions with those 3 anxiety questions and call it distress. Or you can separate them out and call the depression ones depression and the anxiety, which is probably the better way to go.
Yeah, and I know some of the measures that I work with, like in other cohorts on perceived stress, kind of get at anxiety as well. So there's like a perceived stress scale, so you can see if they have something similar to that.
That sounds good.
Speaking to the categorization question that you brought up, and I don't know this field at all, but do you lump all African immigrants or Black immigrants together regardless of where they're immigrating from, like India, for example, versus Africa? I mean, are they considered a homogeneous group? Because it seems like culturally and the expectations may be different depending on where they're coming from.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, and we do have variables that tap into a country of origin. So we have it separated. I was going to combine them just to kind of have that difference between native and immigrant born, just because the literature speaks to this is the trend for most immigrant students, period. But I think adding in another layer of looking at those differences between where they're immigrating from might be interesting. There are a lot of black or predominantly black nations within the data set, so it'd be a question of which ones do you end up comparing. But yeah, it could certainly be done.
Do you have Africans in there?
We do.
Yeah, it's going to vary a lot based on the nation. For
Yes.
Africa.
And I suppose we could combine all the African nations and make that no.
Well, yeah, I don't know that much about it either, but I'm thinking Nigerians are going to be really different, really different than like, sub-Saharan, I don't know, pick a country. And there's going to be a lot of Nigerians probably, so, but let's think about it a lot more.
I come from an anthropology background originally, so I find every aspect of what you're doing personally interesting. My comment, just hearing it, and I realize you're at the beginning, is that it's too much. There's too many different elements. I don't know if high expectations is considered a negative thing or a positive thing. Are immigrant children in general more depressed? My instinct is that they're not, they're less. So I think my first instinct is just that it's really interesting, but we want to know, at the end, what are we hoping to get out of it? And I think there's way too many elements to be able to come out with something cogent at the end at this point. So it might be good to drill down a little more on a smaller number of hypotheses with a smaller number of questions.
My question is actually kind of related to that. So first, how is the degree of educational expectations or so demandingness, how is that operationalized in this data set?
Yeah, there's a direct question of what do you expect of your students? Do you have, and it's categorized, it's categorical with I expect them to achieve a lot. I am satisfied if they just get a high school diploma. I'm indifferent. So it's categorized that way, but it's directly asked.
Gotcha. And are there any measures of just parenting style? And kind of where I'm going with this is that, so in child world, the idea of like authoritarianism, authoritative, neglectful, permissive parenting is, like, I don't know, it's kind of nature. But it's thought of as these two scales, so demandingness and support. And demandingness isn't necessarily always a bad thing or a good thing. It depends on the support level. So if your authoritative parents are highly demanding, but they're also highly supportive of their kid, they're very kid-centric. And that, so demandingness is really only associated with kind of negative outcomes when it's also paired with that low support. So that's when it's predictive of depression and anxiety symptoms. Now I see in your model you're not directly relating educational expectations to any of that kind of mood stuff, but if that's information that you have, I would think it would be kind of important as just a moderator somewhere in your model.
That's something I need to explore. The parent level data that they have and parenting style. You're right, would be interesting addition to this.
Can I just piggyback on that one real quick? That's interesting, and for this sample, that how they redo those parenting styles by race then, and they say, in the context of African American low-income neighborhoods, they say authoritarian is actually the most effective parenting style. And so you get really tripped up because you happen to want to study Black immigrants that, in a very kind of potentially like dangerous neighborhood situation, it is best where the parents say, you cannot go out on the street tonight. Whereas in, kind of that original model is very sort of more middle class based. So that's interesting. That could be a dissertation right there. Yeah.
Our future direction.
Yeah.
So I also find this area of inquiry very interesting, but I certainly have some bias as a child of Black immigrants, and so I'm going to try and stick to what I know from the literature rather than personal thoughts. You mentioned the possibility of, it sounds like your data set has the ability to tease out whether someone is in that, you called it 1.5 versus 2 or 1.
Yeah, 1 versus 2.
1.5 versus 2. I think that's a really important distinction. I'm just thinking about the idea of assimilation and some of the literature that indicates that the longer that a family has been in the United States, the more they're likely to adopt a lot of, cultural habits that are more similar to native U.S.-born families or children, I guess. I am wondering if your data set has any information that gets at maybe more of that detail in terms of how long, or when the parents came, how long ago they came to this country, or
Yeah, they have those direct measures of how long have you been in the U.S. if you were not native born, and as well as when did your parents, or how long have your parents been there? And no, I think that's a really great point. And one of the things I had hoped to do in looking at the differences between 1.5 and 2 is to tap into acculturation, to see the process and the influence that might have kind of on the expectations from the parental side, but also from the student side as well.
Right. And another thought that I have related to that, whether you're able to address this also depends on the data set, but I think that concept, kind of like where the family lives, is really important to that concept, whether they're in some sort of cultural enclave or, whether they're living in New York or Atlanta or cities where there might be a lot more folks of similar background, or if they're living in a community with a lot more of those, people who share, I guess, social origin or culture. That is a whole probably another level of detail that might not be captured in this data set, but I'm just wondering about that kind of like clustering of culture and how that might be relevant to, what you're conceptualizing.
I will say that the data was collected in Miami and San Diego, two areas known for high immigrant populations. So, that'd be interesting. Other.
I think you just need to think about what framework you want to house like the cultural differences in. I mean, like I use Annette LaRose Unequal Childhoods in my research, but I don't know if she really ever focused on like differences immigrants might have for consulted cultivation versus natural growth. So I think the suggestion you made, definitely you should explore. And also just thinking like, why from like a health standpoint does the mental health of immigrant students matter? Looking into its potential influence in the immigrant health paradox might be a good kind of framework to work under. Because really, I mean, I would expect their health to still be better than Native Black Americans, just because the historical and cultural structure is different between those two groups. And so I guess just like thinking about, since this is a longitudinal study, what could your results mean for information as immigrant populations age that would be more applicable to people in many fields regarding health?
That's a great point. Thank you.
I think just in terms of thinking about like operationalizing, because there are a lot of good ideas here. It seems like a lot of your hypotheses are kind of like nested within each other. So maybe thinking about like what's the main kind of overarching question you have, and a good first step may be to take all of these different kind of thoughts of different factors that may be influencing, your outcome, and kind of seeing as a first pass, like which one of these in this data set are actually popping up as like significant factors, and that can kind of guide your direction for, okay, maybe we want to investigate this factor like depressive symptomology a little further, or if you think about maybe having a variable in your modeling for all the different kind of origins of the immigrants, like some kind of like regional indicator, and if you see that pop up where immigrants from this region tend to, there's a stronger association with the outcome, then that can kind of guide where you're looking a little further. Because there are a lot of good ideas, but they may not all actually kind of be influencing your population.
That's fair. Thank you.
One question about, with this T32, does this fit under the rubric of the T32? Would be just.
Health services, outcome research.
Is it close enough?
Your question? Don't know.
Okay.
Answer right off the top of my head.
No, that's fine. I just, it was one of the first things that
No,
struck me.
I understand, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very interesting, obviously, but yeah.
I mean, you're trying to get depression, which is a health outcome.
Right.
But,
Is that your?
So, as his advisor, I could, we want to work with you all, so we can try to target better,
Yeah. Perhaps it will.
Yeah, okay,
I think to John's point, honing in on it will help do that
okay,
a little bit.
okay.
I did have one question, since the cohorts work from Miami and San Diego. So are those similar as far as?
Or is that generalizable?
Yeah, those are two very wonderful places to visit, but I just don't know how generalizable that is. And then I don't know this is another issue. Are the educational systems in those communities generalizable to the rest of the country as far as school types? Again, this may be irrelevant. Classroom sizes, things like that.
That's a great point. So Portes, Alejandro Portes, who was the chief investigator of the study, was really interested in looking at kind of Cuban differences originally and Mexican differences as well. So I think that kind of influenced those locations, and then everything else that was collected was just kind of reflective of who was there.
Right.
And, I'm tapping into kind of the rest of the folks who was there, and not but yeah, that's a good point about generalizability.
Yeah.
To that point, looking at GPA may be not a great measure for your academic achievement, because what GPA means at one school district is very different from another school district.
Yeah.
So if you have access to standardized test data, that may be a better proxy.
What about measures of resilience versus, what ultimately are you using as the way to measure the mental health of these kids? Do they come out of this immigrant experience resilient, or do they come out broken? And how is it related to the support that they have, whether they're in a homogeneous environment, whether they have authoritarian parents that are supportive versus not supportive? Maybe, like Matt suggested, maybe there's a way to just pick sort of one overarching question and then be able to pull these clusters out as you look at it.
you might also want to consider latent class analysis, so that the groups, so that you can see what the data actually does say about what different groups exist in the data for pairing style. And that, would kind of help, it would kind of take some of the burden off of you to try and figure out when the data can tell you what's there.
That's a good point.
especially something like a first step before you do like a structural quotient modeling, like you proposed here, like something that just looks at what are the relationships that are in your data before you're trying to predict things from other things.
Gotcha.
Because that could be paper one and that could be paper two.
And I'm going to agree with Kaylee about depressive symptomology being very relevant to health services and outcomes, but you may want to look at some of the frameworks that I think even folks in your department have been doing some work, maybe in other groups, immigrant groups, and how they are framing this within a larger conceptual framework about health outcomes, given that depressive symptoms or depression is so relevant to health, other forms of health, physical health outcomes. And I'm just wondering if there might be other things you might explore within that data as well. But I don't know what, all the measures that are there, but it might be connecting to Matt's point about kind of seeing what's there. Yeah, you just might consider how other variables might also be relevant to that framing.
Yeah, like, do we know much about like the mental health of this specific population? I forget your literature reviewed at the beginning, like maybe there's increased depression for one reason, or I mean, just describing that will be helpful, and then.
Yeah, I could almost envision like the first paper being, in a population of immigrants, what factors are associated with academic achievement, and then based on what signals kind of pop up there, that can kind of guide you to look at maybe a few of those factors more in depth, and then it can kind of lead you to looking at, different origins of immigrants as kind of your last step, and say, okay, we see these factors in this population of data, or this data we have, how does it differ across these immigrant populations, or something along that lines, where it's a little more you can kind of see from start to finish where you're going with, with all of these different ideas in terms of, you're investigating all of these things you want to, but, some of them may not be as important as others, and so you may just want to focus on what are kind of the bigger issues.
That's a really great point.
I'm taking notes, but I missed what would be the first paper.
Well, I mean, just one thought is to look in this population. If you're interested in academic achievement in a population of immigrants, maybe looking at all the different factors that you have available and see kind of what signals are popping up as kind of influencing that. And you can kind of dig a little deeper and try to make some inferences from that, and that can guide your subsequent analysis.
Thank you.
I like that approach a lot.